In recent years, the idea that education fosters economic growth has all but become a global truism. Today, the push toward greater emphasis on education is one that transcends traditional partisan lines. An overwhelming majority of economists from across the ideological spectrum agree that education is indispensable to both economic development and poverty eradication. The logic is simple. If a country hopes to build a vibrant and flourishing economy, it must educate its people with the skills needed to succeed in the 21st century. Yet despite this emerging consensus that education is conducive to economic development, inequality remains a persistent characteristic of today's global economy. Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson shed light on the vast disparities in wealth between countries in their 2012 book, Why Nations Fail. According to Robinson and Acemoglu, we live in an unequal world in which rich countries are healthier, better educated, and more responsive to the needs of the people. A recent UNICEF report revealed nearly half of the world's population, more than 3 billion people, live on less than $2.50 a day, and 1.3 billion live in extreme poverty, earning less than $1.25 per day. Understanding the forces that drive productivity is essential because, as Acemoglu and Robinson point out, economics is not a zero-sum game. This gross inequality we see worldwide doesn't just have consequences for the lives of individual people in poor countries. It also causes grievances and resentment with huge political consequences in the United States and elsewhere. Thus, for our project, we decided to explore the relationship between a country's level of education and its corresponding economic output, hoping to gain empirical data to back up the claim that education is conducive to economic growth. To begin our investigation, we plotted GDP per capita, measured in US dollars, against the mean number of years in school for men ages 25 and older. The evidence, as you can see by this strong upward trend, is fairly conclusive. Countries whose populations spend more years in school tend to have higher GDP per capita. The disparities are vast. As of 2009, countries like the United States and Norway, where men over the age of 25 average more than 13 years of schooling, enjoyed GDP per capita of $48,000 and $63,000 US dollars, respectively. By comparison, in Somalia and Ethiopia, where men over 25 have less than 3 years of schooling on average, the mean incomes per person are $615 and $896, respectively. As expected, the relationship between mean years in school and the poverty rate followed along similar lines. Here we see a strong negative trend, indicating that in countries where constituents spend more time in school, we expect lower poverty rates. Looking further into the data, which initially we had used only as a measure for comparison between countries, we wanted to see if this correlation between education and poverty could be used to explain the development of individual countries over time. Thus, we decided to track the progress of India and China, two developing nations that experienced significant transformation throughout the latter half of the 20th and early 21st century. The data speaks for itself. Between 1978 and 2009, the mean years in school for men over 25 in India doubled, while the poverty rate, which is measured by the percentage of people earning below $2 a day, fell by nearly 20 percentage points, from 89% to 70%. The story in China is perhaps even more eye-opening. As the average years in school for men 25 and older rose by more than 3 years from 1981 to 2008, China saw a nearly 70% reduction in the percentage of people earning below $2 a day. Both of these trends provide significant evidence toward the claims we seek to defend, that education is conducive to economic growth and that it can play a critical role in the fight against poverty. Taken in the aggregate, the data appears convincing. As the mean years in school for men over the age of 25 increases, incomes rise and poverty falls. However, while these trends are strong, they are far from irrefutable. Thus, we would be remiss not to address some of the limitations that prevent us from concluding that increased education causes economic growth. First, although increases in education generally resulted in economic growth across the board, this was not the case for all countries. Starting from the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and continuing through the 90s, former Soviet countries saw remarkable economic decline despite persistent increases in the average years of education for men over 25. This signals two things. First, that education is not the only factor that contributes to productivity, and second, that human capital flight, also known as brain drain, poses a distinct challenge to nations across the world. Lifting of exit restrictions came on the heels of the Soviet collapse, and as a result, former Soviet countries saw the emigration of many highly skilled persons who could have played a role in their country's transitions. Furthermore, it is important to understand the complexity of the relationship between education and economics. From the data, it is clear that education levels and economic productivity move together. But from this, can we definitively say that improvements in education will spur economic growth? Here we have the classic chicken and egg paradigm. Which comes first? Increased education levels or economic growth? Does education drive the economy or is it the other way around? Ultimately, we argue that both statements are probably true to varying degrees. It is unlikely a country will achieve significant economic growth without educating its population. But it is also unlikely that a country will build an impressive education system without first achieving a baseline level of economic growth. Another obvious limitation stems from our inability to account for differences in the quality of education across country lines. Is a year of schooling in Somalia equivalent to 1 year in the United States? Yet in spite of all these limitations, we remain confident that the information gathered points to a compelling correlation between education and economic growth. While it is true that education is one of many factors that contributes to productivity, we argue that effective policies targeted at increasing the access and quality of education can play a significant role in the war against world poverty.